The night Hannah Reed buried her daughter, it didn't even rain. She had expected something from the sky. Some acknowledgement, some small mercy from the universe that would at least match the weather to the weight of what she was carrying. But the sky over Callow Creek stayed dry and indifferent. The stars scattered above the little churchyard like they had somewhere better to be. And Hannah stood at the edge of a hole in the ground that was barely bigger than a bread box, holding herself together with both arms, because if she let go, she wasn't sure what would happen. Lily. That was the name she'd chosen. She hadn't told anyone yet. She'd been saving it, the way you save the last good thing on your plate, stretching out the sweetness of it. Lily Ann Reed. She'd stitched it on the inside of the small blanket she'd spent the last 2 months of her pregnancy sewing, working by lamplight, while her back ached and her ankles swelled and she talked to her stomach in a low, steady voice because she'd read somewhere that babies could hear through skin. The baby had lived for 6 hours. The doctor had a lot of words for what happened, medical words, clean and distant, the kind of language designed to put a wall between the speaker and the grief of the person listening. Hannah heard almost none of it. She heard 6 hours, and then there was a sound like water rushing behind her ears, and the rest of the room went muffled and far away. That was 3 weeks ago now. She was living in this back room of her sister Margaret's house on the edge of Callow Creek, in a room that was meant for storage, where Margaret's husband Carl had grudgingly moved some of the boxes to make space for a cot and a small dresser. The room smelled like old wood and something damp that never quite dried out, and the window faced the side of the barn, so Hannah's view was unpainted planks and a rusted hinge. She tried not to take up much space. She cooked when she could, scrubbed the floors when her body let her, kept quiet at the dinner table when Carl came home tired and short-tempered. Margaret was kind in the way that people are kind when kindness costs them something, genuine at the root of it, but strained at the edges. "You'll get back on your feet soon," Margaret said often, in a voice that was trying hard to believe what it was saying. What neither of them said out loud was what everyone in town already seemed to understand. Hannah had come to Callow Creek pregnant and unmarried, following a man named Thomas who had taken one look at her belly when she arrived and found a reason to disappear. She had no money, no work, no husband, and now no baby. What she did have, the cruelest, most relentless reminder of what she'd lost, was her body, still doing exactly what it was built to do, still producing milk for a child who was in the ground. She had asked the doctor what to do about it. He'd been brief and clinical about that too, told her it would resolve on its own in time, gave her instructions she followed with the grim efficiency of someone completing a task that had no real point. But the ache was constant, physical, a specific, insistent kind of pain that wasn't quite like anything else. Not sharp enough to scream at, not dull enough to ignore. It sat behind her ribs and reminded her every few hours what she was missing. She stopped going into the main part of town. The looks were too much. The pitying ones from the women, the assessing ones from the men, the quickly averted eyes from people who didn't know what to say and so chose to look at the ground instead. The minister's wife had stopped her once, outside the dry goods store, and clasped her hands with both of hers and said, "The Lord works in mysterious ways, dear." And Hannah had smiled and nodded, and then walked home and sat on the edge of her cot for an hour without moving. She was 26 years old and she felt 112. It was Carl who finally said what had been building in the house for weeks. He didn't mean to do it cruelly, or maybe he did. Hannah could never quite tell with Carl. But he said it at supper on a Wednesday while passing the bread without looking at her. "You can't stay here past the end of the month." Margaret made a small, pained sound across the table. Carl didn't look up. "I got nothing against you, Hannah, but we got 3 kids and the winter stores to think about, and you haven't brought in $1 since you got here. That's the truth of it." "Carl," Margaret started. "She knows it too," Carl said. "Don't you, Hannah?" It wasn't really a question. Hannah looked down at her plate and said, "Yes, I know." After supper, she went to her room and sat on the cot and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding. She had 11 days and approximately $2.40. There was no work she could find that would solve that problem in 11 days. Not respectable work, anyway. Not in a town that had already quietly decided who she was and what she deserved. She was thinking about this, turning it over and over in her mind the way you work a splinter you can't quite reach. When she heard the voices through the thin wall, Margaret and her neighbor, a woman named Dottie Phelps, talking in the kitchen while they washed up. Hannah wasn't trying to listen. She just couldn't not hear. "Heard it from the doctor's wife," Dottie was saying. "She passed right there on the table, not 2 hours after the second one came." "Lord have mercy," Margaret's voice low and horrified. "Barrett's been out there for 4 days now with those babies, and they say he can't get them to eat. He's tried everything, hired one of the Garner girls to come out, but she's never nursed before. She doesn't have—" A pause, a delicate arrangement of silence. "You know, he's trying to bottle feed them? He's trying everything. They're too small, Margaret. They came early, and they're too small, and if someone doesn't help that man soon, those babies aren't going to make it." Hannah stopped breathing. "Surely someone in town. You'd think. But it's the distance, partly. He's out past the Henley Road. It's a real ride. And I don't know. People are strange about going out to a widower's ranch, a man alone. You know how people talk." "What's his name again? Barrett?" "Cole Barrett bought the Henley place 3 years back. His wife was Sarah. Sweet woman. I only met her the once." Dottie's voice dropped. "Those poor babies. They're twins, a boy and a girl. They say the boy is weaker. 4 days, Margaret." Margaret said something about it being a tragedy. Dottie agreed. The water kept running. The conversation moved on to something else. Hannah sat very still on her cot in the dark. 4 days old, a boy and a girl. Too small, too early, and nothing to feed them. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, a habit she'd developed without realizing it, a way of checking herself, of feeling whether there was still something functioning under the grief. Her body had been a source of nothing but pain for 3 weeks. A reminder of failure, a thing she resented every morning when she woke up and every night when she lay down. She thought about that for a long time. She wasn't a brave woman. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind. She had never been particularly courageous, had spent most of her life making the safe choice, and watching the safe choice cost her anyway. Thomas had seemed safe. Callow Creek had seemed like a fresh start. Even the pregnancy had felt, in its way, like something that would finally be hers, something no one could take or ruin or leave. But the babies were 4 days old, and the boy was weaker. She found the Henley Road marked on a rough map Margaret kept in the kitchen drawer, traced it with her finger in the dark, put it back. She lay down on her cot with her coat and her boots still on, and told herself she was just resting, just thinking, and somewhere between the thinking and the dark, she made a decision that didn't feel like bravery, so much as simple arithmetic. She had something those babies needed. She had nothing to lose. She left before midnight. The road was longer than it looked on a map. She had a lantern, but the wick was low, and the light it threw was pale and unreliable, catching the edge of the ruts in the road, but leaving everything beyond 3 feet in total darkness. An owl called from somewhere in the tree line. The wind off the fields had teeth in it, and she hadn't brought enough layers. She hadn't been thinking about layers. She'd been thinking about getting out the door before she could talk herself out of it. She walked for an hour and a half. Her feet found every rock. The Barrett Ranch came into view as a cluster of dark shapes against a slightly lighter sky. A farmhouse, a barn, a structure she couldn't identify. There was a light in the window of the house. Faint, low, like a single lamp turned down to almost nothing. She stopped at the gate. There was a moment, a genuine, serious moment, where she nearly turned around, where she thought about what this looked like. A woman showing up at a man's ranch in the middle of the night. What anyone would say, what the right and sensible thing to do was. Then from inside the house, faint and thin and desperate, she heard a baby crying. She unlatched the gate. She had to knock 3 times before she heard movement inside. And then it was a long time before the door opened. Long enough that she'd started rehearsing what she was going to say, had discarded 4 different versions of it, and had settled on the most direct thing she could manage because she'd learned that direct was faster. The man who opened the door looked like he'd been taken apart and put back together wrong. He was tall. She noticed that first, with the kind of build that comes from actual physical work, wide in the shoulder, rough-handed. But he was wearing a shirt that was buttoned wrong, 2 of the buttons misaligned so the collar sat crooked, and there were dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. And he was holding a baby against his chest with the careful, terrified grip of someone who had been warned that the thing he's carrying is fragile. He stared at her. I'm Hannah Reed, she said. I'm staying at my sister's house on Miller Street. I was told that your babies that you've been having trouble feeding them. He kept staring. The baby against his chest made a small hitching sound. I lost my daughter 3 weeks ago, Hannah said, because she'd decided she wasn't going to talk around it. She was going to say the hard thing plainly and let him do what he wanted with it. And my body is still, she stopped, started again. I can feed your babies, Mr. Barrett, if you'll let me. The silence that followed was one of the longer ones of her life. The wind moved between them. Inside the house, the other baby was still crying, thinner now, more exhausted sounding. Cole Barrett's jaw worked. He looked at her like he was trying to determine whether she was real. You walked out here, he said finally. His voice was rough with sleeplessness. At midnight. The road wasn't too bad. He looked past her at the dark, empty road she'd come from. Then he looked back at her. My son hasn't kept anything down in 18 hours, he said. It came out flat, toneless. The voice of a man reporting facts because feelings were no longer something he could afford. The girl is better, but she's not right either. He stopped. I don't know what I've been doing. Can I come in? He stepped back from the door. The inside of the house was functional and rough, and organized in the way that a man's space organizes itself when there's been no woman in it. Things in practical places, nothing decorative, a clean kind of sparse that wasn't quite comfortable. There was a wooden cradle near the fireplace, and in it was a baby girl who had worn herself out crying and was now making small, desolate sounds, her face still scrunched from the effort. Cole Barrett moved to a chair near the fire and shifted the boy in his arms so Hannah could see him. He was very small. She'd known he would be small, she'd been told premature too early, but seeing it was different. His face was reddened and scrunched, his breathing shallow and ragged, and he had the look of something that was fighting very hard on, not very much. His hands were the size of walnuts. Hannah sat in the chair across from Cole and held out her arms. He hesitated. One last second of hesitation, the split-second calculation of a man deciding whether to trust a stranger with the thing he loves most in the world. He put the boy in her arms. What happened in the next few minutes was private and unglamorous, and had nothing cinematic about it. Hannah simply did what her body had been trying to do for 3 weeks. The baby, this tiny, furious, exhausted, starving boy, latched on with the instinctive desperation of something that has been fighting to survive. And for a moment, Hannah couldn't see clearly because her eyes had filled up without her permission, and she turned her face slightly to the side so the man across from her wouldn't see. Cole Barrett sat perfectly still. He was watching his son with an expression Hannah didn't look at directly because it felt too private, the particular gutted tenderness of a man watching something he'd almost given up on. The baby boy ate and kept it down. After a while, the girl in the cradle had grown loud enough that Cole picked her up and held her out with a questioning look, and Hannah shifted the boy, whose grip on consciousness had begun to loosen towards sleep. That drugged, full-bellied sleep that is the most satisfying thing in the world to watch in a baby, and took the girl too. The girl latched faster. She was stronger, like they'd said, and she ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting and was not going to waste the opportunity. The fire in the hearth ticked and settled. Cole got up and added another log, more for something to do with his hands than because the room needed it. He came back and sat down, and for a while neither of them said anything. I don't know your name, Hannah said finally. I know Barrett, but your given name. Cole. Hannah, she said, though she'd already told him. I know. She looked at the girl in her arms, the boy against her side. Do they have names? Something shifted in his face. I named the girl, Sarah, for her mother. I haven't been able to... A pause. The boy. I keep starting to name him and I can't finish it. Hannah didn't say anything to that. She died on the table, Cole said. The words came out careful, like he'd been holding them in his mouth for 4 days and was only now letting himself speak them. They gave her the chloroform for the pain, and she didn't... Her heart. He stopped. The doctor said she wouldn't have felt anything at the end. I'm sorry, Hannah said. It was inadequate. She said it anyway. I sat with the babies all that first night, he said, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. I kept thinking Sarah would come tell me. Habit, I guess. 4 years of marriage, and you get used to somebody knowing the answer when you don't. He looked at his hands. She always knew the answer. The fire popped. I asked half the women in town, he said. Some said they'd try but couldn't manage the ride out here. Some said they'd come and then didn't. A few just... He shook his head slightly. They didn't want to be seen out here. A man alone. I heard. You still came. Hannah looked down at the boy, who had gone entirely slack in sleep, his small fist resting open against her arm. I had something you needed, she said, and nothing else going for me. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but the shape of it was there. That's honest. I don't have a lot of energy for anything else. They sat in silence for a while longer. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the house in long, cold gusts. The fire was warm. The babies slept. You can take the spare room, Cole said eventually. It's got a real bed, better than walking back in the dark. I'll take the chair, Hannah said. There's a room. I'll take the chair. She wasn't going to explain it, that she wasn't ready to be in a room with a door, that the chair near the fire with the babies was exactly what she could manage right now. I'll be fine. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. He fell asleep in his own chair sometime after 2 a.m, his head dropping to the side, the desperate animal exhaustion of 4 sleepless days finally pulling him under. Hannah watched him for a moment, the crooked shirt buttons, the rough hands loose in sleep, and then looked back at the fire. She had walked out of her sister's house with $2.40 and no plan. She had arrived at a stranger's door in the middle of the night and offered the most personal thing a woman has to offer, and a desperate man had let her in. She didn't know what happened next. She had learned in the last several months that she was not good at predicting what happened next. The boy shifted in his sleep and made a small sound, and without thinking, she moved her hand to his back and felt the tiny, reassuring thud of his heart. For the first time in 3 weeks, the ache behind her ribs was not the loudest thing in the room. Outside, the wind kept on. The fire kept burning. The night was long and the morning was still a long way off, and Hannah Reed sat in a stranger's chair in a stranger's house and kept watch over 2 small lives that weren't hers and felt, distantly, like she might survive this after all. She didn't let herself think beyond that. Survival first. Everything else could wait. She stayed 3 days before anyone noticed she was gone. Margaret probably assumed she'd gone for a walk, or to the store, or to sit by the creek the way Hannah sometimes did when the walls of the storage room pressed too close. Carl likely didn't notice at all. It wasn't until the 3rd morning, when Dottie Phelps came by for coffee and asked after Hannah, that Margaret walked to the back room and found the cot made up with the blanket folded at the foot of it, and Hannah's second dress missing from the hook on the wall. By then, Hannah had already fed the twins 4 times each. She had learned that the boy, still unnamed, which bothered her more than she let on, liked to be held tilted slightly to the left, and that the girl Sarah would not eat calmly if there was any noise in the room. So you had to wait until her brother was quiet. She had learned that Cole Barrett slept like a man catching up on a debt, deep and sudden and almost violent in its completeness, and that he woke the same way, immediately awake, immediately present, none of the groggy middle ground that most people lived in. She had also learned that he did not know what to do with her being there. He was grateful. That much was obvious. In the way he refilled her coffee before she asked and brought in extra wood for the fireplace without comment, and made sure there was food on the table, even when he clearly hadn't eaten much himself. But there was a stiffness to it, a careful quality to how he moved around her, as if he was afraid of misstepping in some way he couldn't name yet. On the morning of the 4th day, he came into the kitchen and found her standing at the stove with one twin in a cloth sling against her chest and a pot of oatmeal on the burner, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the scene with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not exactly surprise. More like someone who has been braced against a blow that hasn't come and doesn't know how to unbrace. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. I mean the cooking. You don't have to. I'm already standing here. She stirred the pot. Do you want some or not? He pulled out the chair and sat down. Yes. That was more or less how it went in those early days. Not comfortable exactly, but finding a working arrangement in the silence and the practical demands of 2 premature babies who needed constant attention. Cole took the nighttime hours seriously. He would wake for the twins, bring them to Hannah, and then pace the kitchen while she fed them, sometimes talking, sometimes not. She learned that he'd come to Callow Creek from further east, that he'd bought the Henley land because the soil was better than what he'd grown up on, that his wife Sarah had been the one to pick out the house and the color of the door and the particular variety of apple tree they'd planted together in the side yard the first autumn. He didn't talk about Sarah the way a person talks about grief. He talked about her the way you might talk about a room in a house you've had to close off, mentioning it sometimes, going quiet when you got too close to the door. Hannah understood that kind of silence. She had her own closed doors. On the 5th day, Margaret showed up. Hannah saw her coming up the road from the kitchen window and had a brief, uncharitable thought about pretending not to be home, which she dismissed because there was nowhere to go and 2 babies who weren't going anywhere either. She met Margaret at the door before she could knock. Margaret looked at her sister the way you look at a problem you've been trying to solve and finally located in an unexpected place. "You're here," Margaret said. "I'm here." "Do you know how worried I've been? I left a note." She had, in fact, left a note. It said, "I found somewhere I'm needed. Don't worry. H." In retrospect, she could see how that might not have been entirely reassuring. Margaret came inside. She looked at the house, at the cradle, at the baby asleep in it, and then at Hannah with an expression that was working through several things at once. "You're nursing his children," Margaret said quietly. "His wife died. The babies were starving." "Hannah," her sister's voice had dropped to something careful and close. "People are going to talk." People were already talking. "This is different. This is—" Margaret pressed her lips together. "This is a man's house. You're living in a man's house, alone. With 2 infants. That doesn't matter. And you know it doesn't matter." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was such a Margaret thing to do that Hannah felt a small, involuntary flicker of affection for her despite everything. "Carl is very upset. Carl was upset that I was costing him money. Now I'm not. Carl thinks you've—" A careful pause. He used the word ruined. Hannah pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her sister. She was tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has had very little sleep and a lot of feelings in a short period of time. And she was not in the mood for the conversation they were about to have, but there was no root around it. "I haven't done anything," Hannah said. "I feed his children because his children need feeding. I cook meals because I'm standing in a kitchen anyway. I sleep in the spare room with the door closed and locked." "I believe you," Margaret said, which was something. "But Hannah, what happens when they don't need feeding anymore? What happens in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, when the babies are old enough to go to bottle? You can't stay here past that." "I know. And then what? Then you're a woman who lived alone with a man and has no husband and no reference and even less of a reputation than you came here with." "I know, Margaret." Her sister looked at her, really looked. The searching, exhausted look of someone who loves a person and cannot figure out how to help them. "I don't have anywhere else to be," Hannah said. It came out flatter than she meant it, matter of fact rather than pitying, but it landed in the air between them and sat there. "That's just the truth of it. I don't have anywhere else to be, and those babies needed someone, and I can go back to figuring out my life when they're not starving to death anymore." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He's going to have to pay you," she said finally. "Formally. He has to treat it as a hired position. That's the only way this is even slightly defensible." "I don't think he has much money." "It doesn't matter. There has to be a wage and an agreement, and it has to be the kind of arrangement that anyone could look at and understand." Cole came in from the barn at that point, stopping in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who has walked into a conversation he wasn't expecting. His eyes moved from Hannah to Margaret and back to Hannah. "My sister Margaret," Hannah said. "She's come to make sure you're paying me." Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but the shape of it. He looked at Margaret. "Ma'am." "Mr. Barrett?" Margaret folded her hands on the table. "My sister tells me she's been helping with your children." "She saved their lives," Cole said. It was direct and unembellished, and Margaret blinked slightly, like she hadn't been expecting that particular construction. "Both of them would have been dead by the end of the week." "I believe it," Margaret said, recovering. But I think we need to discuss the terms of her employment here, so that no one can question the nature of the arrangement. Cole pulled out a chair and sat down, which Hannah thought was probably the right move. He recognized a negotiation when it walked through his door. They talked for the better part of an hour. Margaret did most of the talking. Cole listened with his hat on his knee and asked a few questions. The result was a wage, small but real, and an explicit understanding that Hannah's role was that of a nurse and housekeeper, engaged in professional capacity. Margaret left looking slightly less worried than when she'd arrived. Not much, but slightly. That evening, Cole put a plate of money on the kitchen table without comment. Hannah looked at it, then at him. "You don't have to start yet," he said. "She just wants it formal." "She's not wrong." "No," he agreed. "She's not." Hannah put the money in her pocket. The weeks moved in this particular way that early weeks with newborns always do. No real shape to the days, just feeding and sleeping and the constant small emergencies of tiny people with urgent needs and no way to explain them. The boy finally got a name at the end of the second week. Hannah came into the kitchen one morning and Cole was sitting at the table with the boy in his arm and a look on his face like he'd been working on something difficult for a long time and had finally arrived at an answer. "James," he said when she walked in. "I'm going to call him James." She looked at the baby, James, who was at this point filling out in a way that was enormously gratifying to watch, his cheeks rounding, his grip getting strong enough to hold a finger and not immediately release it. "That's a good name," she said. "It was my father's. He wasn't a particularly good man, but he worked hard and he didn't quit. I figure the kid could do worse." He paused. "James Cole Barrett. I'll register it in town." "Sarah and James," Hannah said. "That's good." Cole nodded once, and that was that. She found herself learning things about Cole Barrett the way you learn the layout of a house you're living in. Not all at once, not from a map, but from daily movement through the space. He was not good at asking for help. That was the first thing. He would work himself to the edge of his own capacity before admitting that something was beyond him, and he'd done it before she arrived and clearly would have kept doing it if the babies had somehow survived without her. He was also, and this surprised her, not a naturally quiet person. She'd mistaken his restraint in those first days for taciturnity, but what it actually was, she realized, was grief and sleeplessness wearing the costume of silence. When he had enough sleep and enough coffee, Cole Barrett had opinions about things, and he would tell you them without particular regard for whether you agreed. He thought the town council was running the water management backward and had been for years. He thought the man who ran the feed store was overcharging on oats. He thought the land past the eastern ridge had been misassessed and was worth twice what the county claimed, and he could tell you why, with specifics. Hannah found this unexpectedly comfortable. She had spent a long time around people who chose their words carefully for social reasons, and Cole's directness was like a window opened in a stuffy room. She was less comfortable with some of the other things she noticed. He looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Not in a way that was threatening or even particularly forward. She'd lived in enough company with men to know the difference, but in a way that was something else, something she didn't want to name or examine too closely, because the list of reasons why that was a problem was longer than she had the energy to work through. She was a woman with no money and no standing who was living in his house. Whatever she thought she noticed, she had to be careful about it. She told herself this firmly and regularly. She told herself it so often that it started to feel like she was arguing. It was in the 5th week that things started going wrong in town. She'd gone in for supplies. Cole needed feed for the horses, and she needed particular things for the babies. And she'd felt the change before she understood it. The way conversations went quieter when she approached. The way Mrs. Finch from the dry goods counter had been perfectly civil 3 weeks ago and was now finding reasons to be busy at the back of the store. The way 2 women she didn't know crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. She bought what she needed and went back to the ranch and didn't say anything about it. But then Dottie Phelps came out one afternoon, which Hannah would not have minded except that Dottie came with Reverend Aldrich's wife, a thin, upright woman named Frances, who had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were being appraised for structural damage. Cole was out in the east pasture. Hannah was in the house with the babies when she heard the wagon on the road. She opened the door before they knocked. "Mrs. Phelps?" she said. "Mrs. Aldrich." Dottie at least had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Frances Aldrich looked comfortable in precisely the way that people look comfortable when they have decided they are right. "Hannah," Dottie said, "we just came to check on, well, on everyone. The babies. They're doing very well." Hannah didn't move from the doorway. "Would you like to see them?" She let them in because there was no reasonable way not to. They sat in the kitchen, and she brought Sarah out. James was sleeping. And Dottie made the appropriate sounds over her, and for a few minutes it was almost ordinary. Then Frances Aldrich put her teacup down and said, "Hannah, I'll speak plainly." "Please," Hannah said, "people in town are concerned about the arrangement here. I'm employed as a nurse and housekeeper. Mr. Barrett pays me a wage." "Yes, so we've heard." Frances's voice was steady and without cruelty, which was somehow worse than if she'd been cruel. "The concern isn't entirely about the specifics of the arrangement. It's about appearances. And about what people draw from appearances, whether those conclusions are fair or not." "I see. The Reverend has spoken to several of the congregation. There's a feeling that, as you're not from here, and your situation is somewhat," a pause, "particular, that it would be better for everyone, and most especially for Mr. Barrett's good name, if a more suitable arrangement could be made." Hannah looked at her steadily. "What kind of arrangement?" "There's a woman in town, a widow, Mrs. Grantham, very respectable, experienced with children, well regarded by everyone who knows her. We thought if Mr. Barrett were amenable, she might come and take over the children's care, and—" "The children aren't eating solid food yet," Hannah said. A slight pause. "That's a temporary situation, surely." "It's a biological situation. Sarah and James are 8 weeks premature. They can't digest what a woman who isn't nursing can provide for them yet. When they can, the arrangement changes. I've been clear about that from the beginning." She kept her voice level. She was proud of herself, distantly. "Mrs. Aldrich, those babies were 4 days old and dying when I got here. I walked 3 miles in the dark because my sister's neighbors said 2 infants were starving, and I was the one person in the county who could do something about it. I don't know what conclusion people are drawing from that, but I can tell you what the actual story is." Frances Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "I believe you," she said, and Hannah thought she probably meant it. "But belief and appearance are 2 different things, and in a small town people talk. I know. It's not just talk, Hannah. It can become something more. Your reputation—" "My reputation," Hannah said, "was not in good condition when I arrived." After a moment, Frances Aldrich nodded, just slightly. She finished her tea. She said she hoped Hannah would think about what they'd discussed. She and Dottie drove back to town in the wagon, and Hannah stood at the door until the wagon cleared the ridge, and then went back inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while. When Cole came in from the pasture, she was still sitting there. He looked at the 2 teacups she hadn't put away yet. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her without speaking, waiting. "Frances Aldrich," Hannah said. "She wanted to talk about appearances." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "What did she say?" "That there's a respectable widow in town who could take over." She paused. "They mean well, probably, or at least Mrs. Phelps does. Mrs. Aldrich is harder to read. They have no business—" He stopped himself. "What did you tell them?" "I told them Sarah and James are too small for anything but what they've been getting, and that's true." She looked at the table. "But they're not entirely wrong about the rest of it." "Hannah, I've heard it from Margaret already, Cole. I know how this looks. I know that in 6 or 8 weeks when the babies are older and it's not about what only I can give them." She stopped, folded her hands. "I'm not naive about my situation." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking through something. "I don't want you to go," he said finally. She looked at him. "I'm not saying that because I don't know what I'd do with the babies, that's part of it, but it's not—" He stopped again. Cole Barrett, it turned out, was much more comfortable talking about water management and oat prices than about this kind of thing. "It's not only that, is what I'm saying." Hannah looked at him for a long, careful moment. "Don't say something you don't mean," she said, "because you feel like I need to hear it. I don't do that. Most men do." "I'm aware of that." He was holding eye contact in the determined way of a person who has decided to not look away. "I'm not saying anything I haven't thought about." She thought about the list of reasons she'd been keeping. The long one, the one she recited to herself at night. She thought about the way he'd looked at her this morning when he came in and found her in the kitchen with James and the oatmeal. "I think," she said carefully, "that right now we should both get through what's in front of us. The babies and the town, and one thing at a time." It wasn't a no. It wasn't a yes either. Cole seemed to understand that because he nodded once and didn't push it, and got up and washed up at the basin and started on the evening feeding of the stock without the conversation going any further. But the shape of what he'd said stayed in the room. The talk in town did not improve. It moved in the way that small town talk moves, from murmur to fact to the kind of solidified story that gets told as though it were obvious truth and always had been. Hannah heard versions of it from Margaret, who came out to the ranch twice a week and reported in the faithful, worried way of a person who believes that if she tells you something fast enough, it becomes less damaging. The story the town had settled on was not particularly complex. Hannah Reed, the woman with no reputation and no husband, had moved herself into Cole Barrett's house, and whatever she claimed the arrangement was, everyone knew what it actually was. There was a particular conversation that Margaret relayed that stuck in Hannah's memory. Someone at the church social, Margaret hadn't caught who, had said that Cole Barrett was a decent man who had been taken advantage of by a desperate woman in a vulnerable moment, and that really someone ought to step in for his sake. Hannah turned that one over for a long time. She was used to being the problem. She'd been the problem most of her adult life, by dint of being female and unlucky in the specific ways that society found most disqualifying. But being cast as predatory, as someone who had exploited a grieving man and his starving children, that was a new shape for the same old story, and it landed differently than she expected. Cole, when she told him, was furious in the quiet way that Hannah was starting to recognize as his particular version of fury, not loud, not explosive, just a very complete stillness and a clenching of something in his face. "I'll talk to Aldrich," he said. "It won't help. I'll talk to him anyway." Cole. She waited until he looked at her. The people who are saying this have already decided what they think. You going to talk to someone doesn't change the decision they made. "What do you want me to do then? Let them say it?" "I want you to know that I know what they're saying, and I'm not leaving because of it." She said it plainly, because she had decided that was the only way she knew how to be in this house. "I'm telling you so you know what we're dealing with, not so you'll fix it." He looked at her for a moment, that unblinking, thinking look of his. "Okay," he said. "Okay." It was not, Hannah reflected, the kind of life she had imagined for herself. It was cold in the mornings, and the water pump was finicky, and she was permanently short on sleep, and there was a town full of people who had decided she was either a scandal or a victim, and neither of those things was what she actually was. But she was not invisible here. That was the strange thing, the thing she kept coming back to when she lay awake at night with James making small sounds in the cradle and the wind moving against the eaves. In Margaret's storage room, she had been invisible, a problem to be managed, a temporary burden with a deadline. In this house, she was seen. By Cole, by the babies who reached for her hands before they could even really see, by the fact of her own daily work made visible in clean floors and fed children and a farm that was running better than it had in weeks. It wasn't what she had imagined, but she had stopped imagining a long time ago, and in its place was something smaller and less certain, and she was beginning to think more real. Outside, the nights were cold and getting colder. The apple tree in the side yard had lost most of its leaves. The twins were getting heavier. And Hannah Reed, who had walked 3 miles in the dark with nothing to offer but her grief and her body's last loyalty to a child she'd lost, stayed. She stayed, and she did not explain herself to anyone who asked, and the town talked, and she let it talk. And inside the ranch house, the fire burned, and the babies grew, and something slow and irreversible was quietly taking hold. The first frost came on a Thursday, thin and white across the pasture grass, gone by mid-morning, but leaving behind the understanding that winter was no longer a future problem. Hannah noticed it from the kitchen window while she was warming the morning milk. James balanced on her hip in the particular way he'd come to prefer, tilted slightly left, her arm under his bottom, his head against her collarbone so he could feel the vibration when she talked. He was 11 weeks old now. He had his father's eyes, dark and watchful, and a habit of grabbing at whatever was nearest with a grip that was, for his size, unreasonably strong. Sarah, in the cradle behind her, was making the low, satisfied sounds of someone just waking up and not yet decided about how she felt about it. They were different babies than the ones Hannah had found 4 days into their lives. That was the only way she could think of it. Different, as if the original versions had been rough sketches and these were the actual thing. James had caught up most of his weight deficit. Sarah had never been as far behind and was now, the doctor had said on his last visit, developing exactly as she should. He'd said it in the measured tone of a man who had not entirely expected to be saying it, which was its own kind of verdict on how bad things had been. Cole had stood in this corner of the room during that examination, his arms crossed, watching the doctor's face the whole time in the assessing way he had, reading people the same way he read weather, looking for the thing behind the thing being said. When the doctor gave his verdict, he'd nodded once, and that was all. But Hannah had caught the way his shoulders dropped a fraction, the releasing of something he'd been holding for weeks. That was the shape of things by the time the frost came. Not easy, not without its tensions and its worries and its particular awkwardnesses, but functional. Real. The ranch was running better than it had in months. Cole said so himself. In the blunt, offhand way he said things that were meant as acknowledgement, but didn't come with instructions on how to receive them. She'd organized the house, learned which chores Cole forgot, and covered them, figured out the rhythm of the land and the stock and the way the day moved here. She knew which floorboard creaked outside the twins' room and stepped over it without thinking now. She knew Cole took his coffee too hot and always burned his tongue and never learned from it. She had stopped reciting the list of reasons why she needed to be careful, not because the reasons had gone away. She'd just gotten tired of the argument. It was a Saturday when Mrs. Grantham came. Hannah didn't know the woman was coming. If she had, she'd have, well, she told herself afterward that she wouldn't have done anything differently, and that was probably mostly true, but she also knew herself well enough to admit that preparation would have helped. She was in the yard hanging laundry when the wagon came up the road, and she registered it as an unfamiliar wagon before she recognized the two people in it, Frances Aldrich, and a woman Hannah had never met but somehow knew immediately. Mrs. Grantham was perhaps 40, with the settled appearance of a woman who had spent years being quietly competent and was comfortable with the authority that gave her. She was dressed better than a ranch visit strictly required, her coat a good wool, her hat pinned with deliberate neatness. She had a round, pleasant face, and the particular manner of someone who is used to being liked, and does nothing wrong exactly but somehow communicates, from the moment she arrives, that she is the kind of person it would be sensible to accommodate. Frances Aldrich helped Mrs. Grantham down from the wagon with a solicitousness that told Hannah everything she needed to know about how this visit had been arranged and what its purpose was. "Hannah," Frances Aldrich's voice was warm, careful. "I hope we're not interrupting. We've come to see the children." "They're inside," Hannah said. She didn't move from where she was standing, which she knew was slightly rude and didn't fix. "Cole's in the north field." "That's all right. We won't keep you long." A small practiced smile. "This is Eleanor Grantham. She's been wanting to meet the little ones." Mrs. Grantham extended a gloved hand. "I've heard so much about them." Hannah shook the hand. "From whom?" A brief pause. "From Frances, mostly, and Dottie Phelps." The smile stayed in place, undisturbed. "It must be such a demanding situation. 2 infants and you managing entirely on your own." "I'm not on my own," Hannah said. "Cole is here." "Of course." Smooth, quick. "Well, may we go in?" She let them in because she had no reasonable way not to. She told herself that as she put the kettle on and sat in her usual chair with James, watching Eleanor Grantham move through the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who had already imagined herself in the room and found it fitted, Mrs. Grantham picked up Sarah from the cradle with practiced, certain hands, the hands of a woman who had raised children, possibly several, and made the appropriate sounds, the warm, cooing noises that babies respond to. And Sarah did respond, looking up at this new face with the wide-eyed, evaluating look she gave everyone until she decided whether she approved. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Grantham said, "and so much bigger than I expected from what Frances had said." "They've both grown a great deal," Hannah said. "You've done a wonderful job." The compliment landed with the quality of something that cost the speaker nothing. "You must be exhausted, though. How much longer do you think—" A delicate gesture. "Before they're ready for regular feeding?" 4 to 6 weeks, Hannah said. Possibly sooner for Sarah. And then you'll be looking to settle somewhere. It was phrased as a concern. Do you have plans? Hannah looked at her. I have the winter to figure that out. Frances Aldrich stepped in, the way she tended to do when conversations got to the edge of something. Eleanor has actually been thinking about this quite a lot, she said, in the tone of someone about to present a solution. She raised 4 children of her own and has a great deal of experience with young ones. And she's been, well, she mentioned to Reverend Aldrich that she'd be happy to help in any way she could. Transition the children into her care, perhaps, once they're ready, if that's what Mr. Barrett decides suits the situation. There it was. Hannah kept her face even. She'd had time, standing out in the yard watching the wagon approach, to understand this was coming. That didn't make sitting here with it in the room with her any easier. That would be Mr. Barrett's decision, she said. Of course. Frances. Still warm. Still careful. We'd never suggest otherwise. We just think it would be good for Cole to know that there are options, that the community wants to support him. A pause. And you, naturally. The back door opened. Cole stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and mud on his boots, having clearly come in from the field when he saw the wagon. His eyes moved around the room. Frances Aldrich, Hannah, Eleanor Grantham holding Sarah, and then returned to Frances Aldrich with the flat taking stock expression Hannah knew meant he'd already assessed the situation and was deciding what to do with it. Mrs. Aldrich, he said, I didn't know you were coming out. We should have sent word, Frances said, with a small, apologetic gesture. We were on our way out to the Henley Road anyway and thought we'd stop in. This is Eleanor Grantham from town. I think you may have met briefly at the Harvest Social last year. Cole looked at Mrs. Grantham. Ma'am. Mrs. Grantham smiled at him with the full warmth of her personality, which was, Hannah had to admit, considerable. Mr. Barrett, I'm so sorry for your loss. Sarah was a wonderful woman. Something crossed Cole's face. The particular quick pain of hearing his wife's name from a stranger's mouth. And then went still. Thank you. He poured himself coffee, and Hannah watched him do it, watched the way he stood at the counter rather than sitting, keeping a distance from the table that was not quite polite but not openly hostile. She also watched Eleanor Grantham watching him, the small assessments happening behind those pleasant eyes. And she recognized it because it was the same thing she'd been doing for weeks herself. Learning the room, reading the person in it. The visit lasted 40 minutes. It would have lasted longer if Cole hadn't, at some point around the 35-minute mark, begun doing the quiet physical work of a man who has other places to be, bringing his cup to the basin, moving toward the door with the patient persistence of a tide going out. Frances Aldrich took the hint and rallied Mrs. Grantham, and the two of them made their goodbyes, and Eleanor Grantham pressed Cole's hand warmly and said it had been a pleasure and that she hoped to see more of the family, and he nodded and said thank you for coming. The wagon went back down the road. Cole stood at the kitchen window watching it go, not saying anything. James had fallen asleep against Hannah's shoulder. Sarah was in the cradle, making small noises. The kitchen was quiet in the specific way kitchens get quiet when something that was just said is still in the room. She seems competent, Hannah said finally. Is that what you think of her? She's got a pleasant manner and she's clearly raised children. She's exactly what she looks like. Cole turned from the window. He looked tired in a different way than usual. Not sleep-deprived, but worn. Frances Aldrich has been doing this for weeks. I know she has. Setting this up, getting people to come talk to me, talk to the congregation. Cole. She kept her voice quiet, even, the voice she used when the twins were fussy and she needed to not add to the noise in the room. What do you want to do? He sat down. Not in his usual chair, but in the one nearest the fire, which happened to be the one he sat in when something was bothering him, though she doubted he knew he did that. What do you mean, what do I want to do? About Mrs. Grantham. About the town, about... She stopped, adjusted James's weight against her shoulder. All of it. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. I want people to leave me alone and let me run my ranch. That's not an answer to the question I asked. He looked up at her. There was a quality to his expression that she hadn't seen before, or maybe she had, and hadn't let herself look at it directly. Something unresolved and uncomfortable. The look of a man with two things pulling at him from opposite directions. "I don't want anything to change," he said. She thought about that. "But things do change. That's what I'm asking you about. When they do, I know what you're asking." His voice had gone slightly rough. "I'm just not... I don't know how to say it in a way that doesn't sound like I'm trying to corner you into something." "Say it plainly," she said. "I've told you before. I can handle plain." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock, and the wind pressed against the house, and James breathed slowly against her neck in the deep, unconscious way of someone completely secure. "I want you to stay," Cole said. "Not because of the babies. Not only because of the babies, I want you to stay because..." He stopped, started again. "This house was working before you got here. The livestock were fed, the accounts were kept, I was managing, but it wasn't..." Another stop. He wasn't good at this. She knew that. She waited. "It wasn't a home," he said finally. "It is now." The room was very quiet. Hannah looked down at James. His fist was closed around the edge of her collar. "I don't know how to be chosen," she said. It came out before she could decide whether to say it, which was probably why it was the honest answer. "I don't mean... I understand what you're saying. I believe you mean it. But I've been chosen before in ways that turned out to mean something different than I thought. And I'm not..." She could feel herself getting toward the edge of something she didn't want to go over in front of him. "I need to know it's real." "How do I show you that?" "I don't know," she said, which was also the honest answer. He nodded. He didn't push it, didn't try to solve it the way some men would have, the men who wanted the credit for the declaration without the patience for the proving of it. He just nodded, and they sat in the quiet kitchen with the babies and the fire, and the conversation ended there, and that was both better and worse than Hannah knew how to deal with. What happened in the following 2 weeks happened the way things happen in small towns when they decide they've been patient long enough. It started with Carl. He came out to the ranch on a Wednesday without Margaret, which was the first sign. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on, which he knew was rude and did anyway, and he talked to Cole in the formal, man-to-man voice he reserved for situations where he wanted it understood that he considered himself a legitimate party to the discussion. Hannah stayed in the doorway. Carl said that Hannah's continued presence at the ranch was a source of difficulty for his family. He said that his association with the situation was causing problems at his place of work, that several men had made comments, that he thought Cole ought to understand the position it was putting people in. He said this all very reasonably, in the voice of a man who was presenting facts rather than making demands, which was worse than if he'd raised his voice. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. When Carl finished, Cole said, "I appreciate you coming to say that in person." Carl seemed slightly wrong-footed by that. "Right. Well, I just thought..." "I'll take it into consideration," Cole said. Carl left. Cole sat at the table for a long time after without talking. Hannah washed the lunch dishes and didn't say anything either, and after a while Cole got up and went back outside, and that was that. But the pressure didn't let up. Francis Aldrich came again, with the Reverend this time, which was a different order of visit. Reverend Aldrich was a mild, careful man who chose his words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, but the weight of what he was there to say came through the mildness anyway. The congregation was concerned, the arrangement was unusual, and was Cole perhaps not aware that Eleanor Grantham had expressed a genuine and sincere interest in the children's welfare, and that she was a woman of good standing who might provide a more... He paused here, and the pause said everything the word didn't. Appropriate situation for the family going forward. Cole sat through this visit the same way he'd sat through Carl's. Listening. Face even. Hands on his knees. When the Reverend was done, Cole said, "I'll think about what you've said." "I hope you will," the Reverend said. "The community's concern comes from a good place, Cole. You have friends here who want to see you and the children settled well." After they left, Hannah said, "You told him you'd think about it." "I told him I'd think about what he said." Cole went to the window. "I didn't say I'd do it." "There's a difference?" "To me, there is." She watched him standing at the window. She could see it happening in real time, the weight of it, the accumulated pressure of Carl and Francis Aldrich, and the Reverend and whatever else was being said in town, settling onto him layer by layer. He was not a weak man, But he was a man who had been alone for 2 months before she came, who depended on this community for the practical business of running a ranch and a life. And no one is entirely immune to the grinding pressure of collective disapproval. No one. She knew she shouldn't say what she was thinking. She said it anyway. Cole, if this is too much, it's not. I'm saying if it is, I understand the position you're in. I came here without asking you about any of this, and the situation is, you saved my children's lives. That's not the point I'm making. It's the point I'm making. He turned from the window. His voice was even but tight in the way that meant he was working to keep it that way. Nobody has the right to tell me who I have in my own house. They don't have the legal right, Hannah said, but they have every other kind. They have the social kind and the economic kind and the kind where they make your life difficult in 100 small ways that add up, and you know that. He looked at her for a long moment. Is that what you want? He said. You want me to tell them they're right? I want you to be honest with yourself about what it costs, she said. That's all. He turned back to the window and didn't answer, and she took that for the complicated thing it was, and didn't push further. The visit from Eleanor Grantham, when it came without Francis Aldrich. That was the thing that surprised Hannah. Not that she came, but that she came alone, and that she came not to the ranch but to Margaret's house, where she knew she'd find Hannah on a Tuesday afternoon when Cole went to the bank in town and Hannah brought the twins to visit Margaret. Eleanor Grantham arrived at Margaret's door with a cake, which was such a deliberate and careful social move that Hannah almost admired it. She came in with warmth and pleasantness and set the cake on the table and played with Sarah for a few minutes. And then Margaret, with the instinct of someone who has been in one too many uncomfortable rooms and wanted out, took James on some excuse and went to the back of the house. Mrs. Grantham and Hannah sat at the kitchen table. I want to be honest with you, Eleanor said. She had dropped the manner slightly, not entirely, but enough that Hannah could see the actual person underneath it, which was more complicated than the social surface. Good, Hannah said. I didn't come out to his ranch uninvited. Francis approached me. I want you to know that. All right. I think what you've done is, I don't know the right word. It was unusual and it was brave, and those babies would not be alive without you. I believe that. Eleanor's hands were around her teacup, not fidgeting, just held. I also think that you know how this ends, not because anyone is cruel, just because of how things work. How do things work? Hannah asked. Eleanor looked at her steadily. He's a man with property and 2 children and his whole life ahead of him. The town has a story it can tell about him, the grieving widower, the good rancher, and that story requires a certain kind of woman beside him, someone with standing, someone who fits. She paused. Not a woman with your particular history, however unfair that is. Hannah was quiet. I'm not saying it to wound you, Eleanor said. I'm saying it because I think you already know it, and knowing something but not saying it out loud doesn't make it less true. What do you want me to do with what you're saying? I want you to make it easier on yourself, Eleanor said, before you get in deeper than you already are. She held Hannah's eyes. He's a decent man. I think he means what he feels. But decent men still make the practical choice in the end. Most of them do. Hannah looked at her. The cake on the table. The light coming through Margaret's kitchen window. The same light she'd looked at for weeks in that storage room. Thank you for being honest, she said. Eleanor nodded. She finished her tea. She said she hoped things would work out well for Hannah, and she clearly meant something specific by that. And then she picked up her gloves and left, and the cake sat on the table, and Hannah sat there looking at it. She was still sitting there when Margaret came back with James. Margaret looked at her sister's face and put the baby in the cradle and sat down. What did she say? The truth, Hannah said. More or less. Hannah. She's not wrong, Margaret. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She's not a bad person. She's telling me what she thinks is going to happen, and she's probably right. You don't know that. I know how things work. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Hannah looked at the window, at the light, at the familiar particular smallness of a life that was not her own life, sitting in someone else's kitchen again. I don't know yet, she said, but something had shifted. Eleanor Grantham had said a thing out loud that Hannah had been managing not to say to herself, and now it was in the room and she couldn't put it back. The decent men still make the practical choice, in the end. And Cole was not soft, not easily swayed. But he'd told the Reverend he'd think about it, and he'd told Carl he'd take it into consideration, and he hadn't said anything to her about any of those conversations until she asked, and the pressure wasn't stopping. She stayed for supper at Margaret's and went back to the ranch in the late afternoon. Cole was in the barn. She put the babies down and made the evening meal and set the table and stood in the kitchen listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboard, the wind against the eaves, James making a small sound in his sleep. She had been here 11 weeks. The following Thursday, Cole came home from town with a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Closed off, worked over, the look of a man who has had a conversation he did not expect. She asked him how town was. He said fine. She watched him hang his coat and pour himself coffee and not look at her directly, and she felt something move through her chest, slow and cold. Cole, I had a conversation with Reverend Aldrich, he said, still not looking. And with James Prentice, he's on the town council. He has some say over my water access rights. A pause. They made it clear that they didn't threaten anything exactly, but they made certain things clear. Hannah set down what she was holding. What did you say to them? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. I said I'd think about the situation. She stood very still. Cole. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. What does that mean? He turned to look at her then, finally, and his face had the specific pained expression of a man who wants to say two different things and cannot figure out how to make them both true. It means I need some time to what? She was not going to cry. She decided that immediately, the way you make a decision before a wave hits, to decide whether I'm worth the trouble. That's not because that is what they're asking you to decide, whether I'm worth what it costs to keep me here. And you told them you'd think about it. Hannah, I understand, she said. And she did. That was the worst part of it. She understood exactly how it had happened, the accumulation of it, the way 10 people saying the same thing in 10 different rooms eventually sounds like truth. She understood it, and it still hit her like a fist under the ribs. She went to the spare room. She didn't slam the door. She closed it quietly, because the babies were sleeping, and she stood in the dark with her back against the door and breathed until her hands stopped shaking. She stayed that night. She fed the twins at 2 a.m. without speaking to Cole, who was awake. She could see the light under his door, and went back to her room. In the morning, she packed the things she'd brought. They didn't fill much of a bag. She fed the babies one last time, both of them, sitting in the chair by the fireplace with the cold morning light coming through the window and James's hand around her finger. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at Sarah in the cradle, that small, fierce face that she knew in every expression it made. She did not let herself feel it. She set it aside in the way she had learned, the blunt and necessary skill of setting a thing aside because feeling it right now would not help anything. Cole was at the table when she came through with the bag. He saw it immediately. He stood up. Hannah, I'm going to Margaret's, she said. The babies are fed. Sarah will want to eat again in about 3 hours. James, maybe 2.5. You should write that down so you don't forget. Hannah, wait. Write it down, Cole. She was at the door. You'll need someone to help you. Mrs. Grantham is the obvious choice. The Reverend's wife can arrange it. Her hand was on the latch. She seems capable. She'll do fine. Will you please just... She opened the door and walked out into the cold morning and didn't look back, because looking back would have ended her, and she needed to get down the road and past the first tree line before she let herself fall apart. She made it to the second tree line. She stood there for a while, in the cold, in the silence, her bag at her feet and the ranch behind her and Margaret's house 3 miles ahead, and the thing she'd been setting aside hit her all at once, and she let it, because there was no one here to see it, and it needed to come out somewhere. The frost was back in the grass, thin and white, same as it had been for weeks now. She picked up her bag and kept walking. She had been at Margaret's for 4 days when Cole Barrett rode into town with both babies. Margaret saw him first from the kitchen window, and she said Hannah's name in a tone that made Hannah cross the room immediately. She looked out at the street, and there was Cole on his horse, moving at a pace that was not quite urgent, but was not his usual pace either, and he was carrying James against his chest in the cloth sling Hannah had sewn from one of her old dresses, and Sarah in the crook of his left arm in a way that looked precarious and exhausted and like a man who had been doing something badly for 4 days and knew it. Hannah's first instinct was to go to the door. Her second instinct was to remember why she'd left. She stayed at the window. Cole tied the horse at the post in front of the dry goods store and went inside, which was not where Hannah would have expected him to go first. She watched the door. Margaret stood beside her without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement about how seriously she was taking the situation. He came out 5 minutes later, went to the post office, then to the feed store. He was not trying to find Hannah, or at least he was not making a search of it. He was doing errands, in town, with both babies strapped to him in various configurations that were functional, if not elegant. "He looks terrible," Margaret said. He did. He'd looked rough when Hannah left on Thursday morning, and whatever the 4 days since had done to him had not improved the situation. His coat was misaligned, and she could see even from a distance that he hadn't shaved, and that James was wearing something that appeared to be one of Cole's shirts knotted into a makeshift swaddle. "Where's Mrs. Grantham?" Margaret said. It wasn't really a question. They both already suspected the answer. Hannah found out later, through Dottie Phelps, who had no particular investment in the drama but an exceptional memory for detail, that Eleanor Grantham had come out to the ranch on Friday morning, the day after Hannah left, and had lasted approximately 6 hours before the situation had overwhelmed her good intentions. She had not been unkind. She had been, by all accounts, genuinely willing. But she was a woman who had last nursed a baby 14 years ago. And Sarah and James Barrett were not accommodating infants. They were opinionated, premature, attached to specific rhythms and specific hands, and not remotely interested in adjusting to a stranger's good intentions. James had screamed for 2 hours straight. Sarah had refused to eat. Mrs. Grantham had sent someone for the doctor, who had come and done what he could, and left with the careful professional face of a man who was concerned but could not solve the actual problem. Eleanor Grantham had stayed through Saturday. She left Sunday morning, which left Cole with 2 babies and no help, starting Sunday, for the 4 days until Hannah was standing at Margaret's kitchen window watching him tie up his horse. She watched him come out of the feed store and stop on the boardwalk, and she saw him stand there for a moment with James against his chest and Sarah in the crook of his arm, and she watched him look up and down the street with the expression of a man who has been working toward something and is now standing at the point where he has to decide whether to actually do it. He turned and looked at Margaret's house. Hannah stepped back from the window by reflex, though she knew at this distance he couldn't see her clearly. "Hannah," Margaret said, "I know." "You should at least—" "I said I know." She knew. She knew because Sarah and James were not abstractions to her. They were real, particular, specific people with specific weights and specific sounds and specific ways of sleeping that she could have described in more detail than she could have described her own reflection. She knew because 4 days of not being where they were had been a particular kind of pain that she had not allowed herself to examine too closely because examining it would not have helped anything. But Eleanor Grantham had failed. Cole had asked for someone respectable, someone town approved, someone the Reverend and James Prentice from the water board could look at and find appropriate. And it hadn't worked. That didn't mean Hannah was the answer. That just meant Eleanor Grantham hadn't worked. Those were 2 different things, and she needed to keep them separate. Cole was crossing the street toward Margaret's house. Hannah stepped back further, into the kitchen, and sat down at the table. Margaret opened the door before he knocked, which was such a Margaret thing to do that Hannah would have found it funny under any other circumstances. "Mr. Barrett," Margaret said in the formal tone she reserved for situations she was handling, "please come in." He came in. He looked at Hannah immediately, the way you look at the thing you came for when you arrive somewhere. And she looked back at him, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet. James, against Cole's chest, made a small urgent sound. Hannah was out of her chair before she made a conscious decision about it. She crossed the room and took James, who was fussing in the specific way that meant hungry, and she stood there holding him with the automatic rightness of something that had been working correctly and then stopped and was now working again. She did not look at Cole's face when she did it. She couldn't afford to yet. "Sit down," Margaret said to Cole, in the voice she used for managing difficult situations. "I'll put the kettle on." Cole sat. He was still holding Sarah, who had gone quiet in that wary, evaluating way she had around strangers in new rooms. He held her carefully and looked at the table. "She hasn't eaten properly since Thursday," he said. His voice was flat with the specific flatness of exhaustion pushed past the point where feelings can reliably function. James ate Friday and Saturday, but it wasn't enough and he's lost weight. I can tell. Mrs. Grantham tried everything she knew. She didn't. He stopped. It's not her fault. I know it's not, Hannah said. A silence. Hannah, he said, I need. He stopped again. She had never seen Cole Barrett at a loss this way, struggling over words like a man who has been taught that asking for things is a weakness and is trying to do it anyway. I handled it badly. What I said to you, what I didn't say. You told the Reverend and James Prentice you'd think about it, Hannah said. She wasn't going to let it be something other than what it was. And you didn't tell me you'd said that. You let me find out from what I could see. Yes, that's what hurt, she said, not the town. The town was going to say what it said regardless. It was that you didn't tell me. He was looking at his hands. I know. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a long moment. Margaret made a quiet business of tea at the counter and did not appear to be listening, which meant she was listening to every word. Because I didn't know what to do, Cole said finally. I didn't know how to. Prentice made it real clear that my water rights renewal comes up in the spring. He didn't say it as a threat exactly, but he didn't have to. He looked up. I've got 2 premature babies and a ranch that barely breaks even in a good year, and my water access depends on the goodwill of men who sit on the town council, and those men listen to Reverend Aldrich. I understand all that, Hannah said. I know you do. That's why I didn't say it, because you'd understand it and you'd tell me you understood it, and then you'd walk out the door anyway, and you'd be right to. He paused. I thought if I just managed it quietly, made them feel heard without actually doing anything, they'd let it go. They weren't going to let it go. No, I know that now. He set his jaw. I should have known it then. Sarah made a small sound. Cole shifted her automatically, and the gesture was so practiced and careful. The tilt, the specific way his hand went to her back, that something in Hannah's chest did something complicated. Mrs. Grantham is a good woman, Cole said. She tried hard, but those babies have been held a certain way and fed a certain way and put down a certain way for 11 weeks, and they know the difference. James cried for most of 2 nights straight. Sarah wouldn't take anything from anyone. He looked at Hannah. They know who you are. They know the difference between you and everyone else. Hannah looked at James, who had settled against her and was breathing in the deep, slowing rhythm of someone approaching sleep. His fist was against her collar. That will fade, she said. Eventually. I don't want it to fade. His voice had changed slightly, less flat, more something underneath. Hannah, I'm not here because the babies need you. I mean, they do, and that's true, and I won't pretend it's not part of it. But I'm here because I spent 4 days in that house trying to figure out how to do this without you, and all I could think was that I'd made exactly the wrong choice, and I needed to fix it. She looked at him. I told Prentice this morning, he said, before I came here. I went to his store, and I told him I wasn't going to make decisions about who lives in my house based on water rights. He can do what he wants with that information. She stared at him. Cole, and I'm going to talk to Reverend Aldrich this afternoon and say the same thing, only with more words because he'll need more words. Something crossed his face, not quite the shape of a smile, but its ancestor. I should have said it 2 weeks ago. I should have said it the day Carl came out. You could lose the water rights. I could. That's not a small thing. That's your ranch. I know what it is. Hannah sat with that. The weight of it. A man who had spent 4 days alone with 2 screaming infants and then ridden into town and told the people who held leverage over his livelihood that they didn't get a vote. That was not a small thing either. Why now? She said. What changed? He looked at her steadily. I watched James cry for 6 hours straight because the person he wanted wasn't there. He's 3 months old and he can't tell me what he needs, but he knew what he'd lost. And I kept thinking, he's right. That's exactly right. That's the correct response to losing something that matters. He paused. I've been so focused on managing everybody else's idea of my life that I forgot to actually live it. Margaret set a cup of tea on the table in front of him and then went efficiently into the other room and pulled the door mostly shut, leaving it open a precise inch, which Hannah thought was the most honest thing her sister had ever done. I'm not asking you to come back because of the babies, Cole said. Though I'll be honest, I'm also asking because of the babies, and I think you know that, and I think you don't hold it against me. I don't. I'm asking you to come back because this is a thing I want. Not a practical thing. Not a convenient thing. A thing I want. He wasn't looking away. Cole Barrett, for all his difficulty with words, had never had trouble holding eye contact when it mattered. I want you to come home. Hannah sat with James in her arms, and the tea on the table, and the sound of Margaret making deliberate noise in the other room, and she let herself feel the whole weight of what he'd said without flinching away from any part of it. She was afraid. That was the honest answer to what she was feeling. Not of Cole. She'd stopped being afraid of Cole as a person fairly early in the first week, when she'd understood that he was exactly what he appeared to be, no layers of performance underneath. She was afraid of being wrong, of being a woman who believed a thing and was wrong about it again, and having to survive that again. I need you to understand something, she said. Tell me, if I come back, it's not as an employee. It's not as a nursing arrangement or a housekeeper or a convenient situation. She held his eyes. I am not going to be the practical solution, Cole. I have been the practical solution for most of my life, and I am done with it. I know. I mean it. I know you mean it. Then tell me what you're actually asking. He looked at her for a long, serious moment, the look of a man making sure his footing is right before he steps onto uncertain ground. I'm asking you to marry me, he said, if you'll have me. I'm asking if you'll come back and be my wife and their mother and the person who lives in that house because she wants to and not because she has nowhere else to be. That's what I'm asking. The room was very quiet. James breathed against her neck. Outside, through Margaret's thin walls, she could hear the sounds of Callow Creek going about its day, indifferent and ordinary. You're asking me to marry you in my sister's kitchen, Hannah said. I am, while holding a baby. Sarah was crying and I couldn't put her down. She looked at him, at the misaligned coat and the 4 days of stubble and the baby in his arms and the absolute unguarded seriousness in his face. There was no performance in him. There never had been. I'll think about it, she said. His face shifted. That's not a no, she said, but I need you to do something first. You said you're going to talk to the Reverend this afternoon. I am. I want to be there. He looked slightly surprised. Hannah, I want to be in the room when you say it, she said. Not because I don't believe you'll say it, because I want to stop being the person who isn't in the room when decisions are made about her. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. All right, and I want you to say it in front of whoever's there. Not just Aldrich, whoever is in that building. Something in his expression settled. Not resignation, but resolution. The look of a man who has made his peace with a course of action. All right. They went to the church at 4 o'clock. All 4 of them, Cole and Hannah and James and Sarah, walking up the main street of Callow Creek in the cold afternoon light in a configuration that probably looked, to anyone watching from the windows of the dry goods store or the post office or the barber, like something they had an opinion about. Francis Aldrich was there, and Reverend Aldrich, and by some combination of word spreading the way it does in small towns, 3 other women from the congregation who happened to be arranging something in the back room and did not look entirely surprised to have a reason to stay. Cole stood in the middle of the church's entry room and said what he'd said he would say. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the same way he said everything, plainly, directly, without extra words. He said he understood that people in this community had concerns about the arrangement at his ranch. He said he'd listened to those concerns and taken them seriously. He said he'd spent 4 days trying to accommodate them, and that in those 4 days his children had not eaten properly and had lost weight and cried for most of 2 nights. And he'd stood in his kitchen and asked himself whether the opinion of the town council was worth more to him than the well-being of his family. He said the answer was no. He said Hannah Reed had walked 3 miles in the middle of the night to save 2 children she'd never met, and had stayed for 11 weeks and done more for that ranch and those babies than he'd managed to accomplish in 2 months of trying alone. And he intended to ask her to marry him, and he wanted to be clear that this was a decision he'd made because he wanted to make it, and not because someone had told him to. Francis Aldrich started to speak. Cole said, I'm not finished, Francis. He waited until it was quiet. Then he said that he understood people might not approve of his choice. He said that was a thing he could live with. He said he'd be renewing his water rights through the county office in March. independent of the town council's recommendation, and that if Prentice had a problem with that, he was welcome to take it up with the county. Then he stopped. The room was entirely quiet for several seconds. Reverend Aldrich said carefully that he appreciated Cole sharing his perspective, that these were matters of the heart and community both, and that he hoped, a measured pause, that Cole would continue to remain part of the congregation. Cole said he'd be in the pew on Sunday, and he expected to keep being in the pew on Sunday. Frances Aldrich said nothing. She was looking at Hannah with an expression that had moved in the space of the last 10 minutes, from resistance to something more complicated and less comfortable. Hannah met her eyes and didn't look away. They walked out of the church into the cold. Cole's breath came out in a long, visible exhale. "Well," he said. "Prentice is still going to be a problem," Hannah said. "Probably. And Frances Aldrich isn't finished. Almost certainly not." They walked down the church steps. James was awake and looking around with the bright, assessing expression he got in new environments. Sarah had fallen asleep against Cole's shoulder in the particular complete way she had, as if she'd decided the situation was resolved and she was done participating. Hannah took James from Cole. He needed both arms for Sarah on the steps, and they stood at the bottom of the church steps on the main street of Callow Creek, and several people walked by who looked at them and then looked carefully away. And one woman who ran the laundry nodded at Hannah with a brisk, brief nod that was not unfriendly. "You said you'd think about it," Cole said. "I'm thinking. That was an hour ago. I'm a thorough thinker." He looked at her, and there it was. The shape of a smile that had been not quite making it to his face for weeks, finally arriving. It was a small smile. Crooked. It was probably the best thing she'd seen in months. "Come home," he said. She looked at him, at Sarah asleep on his shoulder, at James in her arms, who had found her collar button and was examining it with focused, myopic intensity. "I need to get my things from Margaret's," she said. Something in his face opened up. "I'll bring the wagon tomorrow morning," he said. "Don't be late." He wasn't late. He was there at 7, before Margaret had finished breakfast, and Carl actually came out on the porch to watch them load the wagon without saying anything, which was as close to civility as Carl had managed in months, and Hannah chose to take it as progress. Margaret hugged her at the door, long and tight, and said something into Hannah's shoulder that Hannah didn't catch, and when she pulled back her eyes were wet. "Come on Sundays," Hannah said. "Bring the kids. Leave Carl with the children if he won't come. You're my sister, Margaret. You don't need his permission to visit." Margaret wiped her eyes, nodded, stood on the porch until the wagon turned onto the Henley Road and she was out of sight. They drove in quiet for a while. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a hard pale blue, the frost thick on the grass. James was in the basket between them, bundled in his blankets, interested in the sky. Sarah was in her cradle in the wagon bed, asleep. "I'll need to talk to the county office in Delridge," Cole said, "about the water rights. I know a man there. He went to school with my father. He'll deal with it straight." "Good. It's a day's ride. I know where Delridge is. I'm just saying I'll need to go in February." He kept his eyes on the road. "I'd rather not leave you alone with them for a full day. Maybe we should see if Margaret will come stay." Hannah looked at the road ahead. The line of cottonwoods along the creek, bare now, just the shapes of things against the sky. The turn in the road where the Barrett Ranch came into view. "You haven't actually asked me again," she said. He glanced at her. "Properly," she said. "You asked me in Margaret's kitchen while holding a baby, and then we went to the church, and then there was the wagon, and you haven't—" She paused. "Asked me again." He was quiet for a moment. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the side of the road. James made a surprised noise at the change in motion and then settled. Cole turned on the seat and looked at her straight on, the way he did when he decided to say a thing plainly. "Hannah Reed," he said, "will you marry me?" Not quite a question. Not quite a statement. Something in between, in his particular voice, with the frost on the fields behind him and his 2 sleeping and not sleeping children between them and the look on his face of a man who has stopped performing and is just asking. She had been chosen before and been wrong. She had made the practical choice before and been wrong. She had run toward things and away from things, and neither one had reliably worked. What she knew, the thing she actually knew, not the thing she hoped or feared, was that she was sitting in a wagon on the Henley Road with two babies who were alive because she'd walked 3 miles in the dark, and that the man beside her had stood in a church and said what needed saying in front of people who hadn't wanted to hear it, and that when James had been sick last month, Cole had sat up with her until 4 in the morning without being asked, and that they'd been in a quiet room with a sick baby and not run out of things to say. She knew what fear felt like. She'd been living with it for most of a year. This was not fear. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that had been in him for a while. Then he reached over and took her hand. Just her hand, quickly, with a grip that was too tight for a moment and then eased, and held it for a minute before letting go, because James was making sounds that were heading toward louder, and the ranch was a 1/4 mile up the road, and they were people who had things to do. Cole clicked his tongue at the horse, and the wagon started moving again. Hannah looked at the cottonwoods, at the pale winter sky, at James batting at the air above his blanket with that focused, futile energy he had. The ranch came around the bend. The house, the barn, the side yard with the bare apple tree. The door, painted the color Sarah had chosen, the first autumn. Cole brought the wagon around to the gate and got down and came around to help her, and she handed him Sarah's cradle first, and he took it carefully, and then she climbed down herself, and they went inside together, out of the cold, into the house where the fire had gone low, but not out. Cole added wood. Hannah put the kettle on. James made a definitive sound from the basket that meant he'd reached the end of his patience with everyone ignoring him, and Hannah picked him up and held him against her shoulder and walked the kitchen floor with him the way she'd walked it 100 times before. The fire came up. The kettle began to heat. Outside, the frost sat on the fields. In the side yard, the bare apple tree stood where Sarah had planted it, waiting for spring. Inside the house, a woman who had walked 3 miles in the dark and stayed was still here, still standing. And that, it turned out, was exactly enough. They were married on a Saturday in late February, in the county clerk's office in Delridge, with Margaret as witness and the clerk's secretary as the second because the law required 2. It was not the wedding Hannah had imagined as a girl, but she had stopped putting much stock in the things she'd imagined as a girl. Those pictures had not prepared her for any of the actual shape of her life, and she'd found, in the last several months, that the actual shape was more interesting anyway. The clerk's office smelled like paper and wood smoke. James sat in his basket on the counter and stared at the ceiling with the focused wonder he brought to all stationary objects. Sarah, on Margaret's hip, attempted to eat the corner of the official document before Margaret caught her. Cole signed his name and then looked at Hannah, and she signed hers, and that was that. Margaret cried, which she'd promised herself she wouldn't do, and then apologized for crying, which was even more Margaret. Cole shook the clerk's hand. The secretary gave Sarah back the corner of the document because she'd started to fuss, and it seemed like the practical solution. They had lunch at the only eating establishment in Delridge that was open in February, a place with 4 tables and a woman who cooked whatever she'd had that morning and didn't offer a menu. They ate beef stew and bread, and Hannah had coffee, and Cole had coffee, and Margaret had tea, and the babies took turns being held and fussed and then didn't fuss. And the afternoon light came through the window at a low winter angle and lay across the table in a stripe of pale gold. "Well," Margaret said, after a while. "You're married." "We are," Cole said. "I didn't think you'd actually do it in the county office. I thought you'd at least—" She stopped. "Never mind. It doesn't matter." "You thought we'd wait for a proper ceremony?" Hannah said. "I thought you'd want one." Hannah thought about that. She thought about what a proper ceremony in Callow Creek would look like. Who would be invited? Who would come? What Francis Aldrich's face would look like in the front pew? What the town would say about the dress and the flowers, and the question of who gave the bride away when the bride had no one obvious for that role. She thought about all the ways a public ceremony could become something that was more about other people's story of you than about the thing itself. "I have what I wanted," she said. Margaret looked at her for a moment and then nodded and didn't push it further because Margaret, for all her worry and her checking in, had the essential quality of someone who knew when a thing was settled. The ride back to Callow Creek took most of the afternoon. The twins slept in the wagon bed in their joined cradle, rocked by the road, and Cole drove and Hannah sat beside him, and they talked sometimes and were quiet other times, and the quiet had the particular quality of 2 people who no longer need to fill it. Prentice is going to hear about the county registration by end of next week, Cole said, somewhere on the road home. I know. He'll make noise about it. Let him make noise. Cole glanced at her. You're not worried. I'm worried about plenty of things, she said. James's cough, whether we'll have enough hay through March, whether Sarah's going to figure out how to climb out of the cradle before she figures out how to walk, because the way she looks at the top rail, I think she's working on it. She paused. I'm not worried about James Prentice. He looked back at the road. When did that change? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. I think it changed in the church, she said. When you said what you said, and the room got quiet, and nothing fell apart, I kept expecting something to fall apart, and it didn't. The roof stayed up, the walls stayed. She looked at her hands in her lap. I'd spent so long believing that if one person decided against me, everything would collapse. And it didn't. Prentice did decide against you. He decided against both of us. And we're still here. He didn't say anything to that, but she felt the slight shift in him, something releasing, the way it had in the church when he'd finished saying what he'd said, and the Reverend hadn't struck him down, and the world had continued turning. There was a thing Hannah had learned in the last several months that she had not known before. She had thought for most of her life that surviving a thing was the goal. Getting through it, getting past it, reaching the other side with enough of yourself intact to keep going. What she had not understood was that there was a difference between surviving and rebuilding. Surviving was what she'd done with Thomas, with the pregnancy, with Lily, with the storage room and Carl's careful cruelty and the $2.40. Rebuilding was something else. It required deciding that the wreckage was not the end of the story, that you could take what remained and make something on purpose rather than just managing what was left. She had started rebuilding, she thought, the night she'd picked up her coat and walked out of Margaret's house into the dark. Not because it was a brave decision, because it was the only decision that pointed forward. The water rights came through from the county in the first week of March. Cole had known the man at the county office for years, and the registration was straightforward and legal, and when Prentice went to dispute it, he found there was nothing to dispute. Cole Barrett's deed was clean, and his claim was legitimate, and the county had no reason to defer to a town council's interpersonal politics. Prentice made noise as predicted. He said a few things in a few rooms that got back to Cole through the ordinary channels of small-town information. Cole let him say them. Reverend Aldrich preached on the subject of community and acceptance one Sunday in March, which was possibly aimed at the congregation generally, and possibly aimed at the Barretts specifically, and possibly both. Hannah sat in the pew with Sarah on her lap, and James beside her in the box Cole had built that attached to the end of the pew, a flat-topped wooden box with sides, sized exactly right, because Cole had measured twice and built it in an evening without mentioning it until it was done. And she listened to the sermon and found it was easier to listen to than she'd expected. She had been braced, coming to church for the first time as Cole's wife, for something difficult. The looks, the pointed conversations, the women who would find reasons to be busy when she walked by. Some of that happened. Francis Aldrich nodded at her with an expression that was not warm but was not hostile either, and Hannah nodded back, and that was the extent of it. Dottie Phelps came and kissed her cheek and said she was happy for her and seemed to mean it. Two other women she barely knew stopped to admire the babies with the specific, genuine warmth that babies reliably generate in even the most complicated social situations. It was not a triumph. It was not a parade of people who'd been wrong lining up to say so. It was just ordinary. The ordinary complicated texture of a small community that had decided something and was now adjusting. It was slower than Hannah had hoped and faster than she'd feared and exactly as imperfect as the real world tends to be. Spring came. The apple tree in this side yard had looked dead all winter, stripped bare by the cold, nothing to recommend it but the shape of its branches against the gray sky. Then one morning in April, Hannah came out to hang laundry, and there it was, the faint preliminary green of the first leaves, small and tentative and unmistakably alive. She stood there longer than she needed to, looking at it. Sarah had pulled herself upright using the fence rail and was standing, swaying, deeply pleased with herself. She'd started doing this 2 weeks ago and hadn't yet figured out that the next part was walking, so she just stood there every time, triumphant, waiting for someone to be impressed. Hannah was impressed every time. She couldn't help it. "Look at you," she said. Sarah looked at her with Cole's eyes, dark and watchful, and made a sound that was somewhere between satisfaction and demand. Inside, she could hear James talking to himself in the particular long, serious monologue he'd developed over the last month. Not words, not yet, but the rise and fall of something that had the structure of conversation without the content. He had opinions, James Barrett. He expressed them at length to anyone who would listen and several surfaces that wouldn't. She thought about Lily, the way she'd taken to doing, not with the gutting, breathless grief of the first months, but with something quieter. A thought that arrived and was held and released, like water held in cupped hands. Lily Ann Reed, who had lived for 6 hours and been named in secret, and was in the ground in Callow Creek under a stone that Cole had paid to have properly inscribed when he found out it hadn't been done. He had done that without telling her. She'd found out from Margaret, and when she'd asked him about it, he'd looked slightly uncomfortable, as if he'd been caught at something private. She was yours, he'd said. She deserved a proper marker. Hannah had not had a response to that was adequately sized for what she felt, so she hadn't tried. She missed Lily. She thought she would always miss Lily. She had come to understand that this was not a problem to be solved. It was just a fact, like the fact that the pump was finicky, and the east pasture flooded in heavy rains, and some things you carry because they're yours to carry. But grief, she'd found, did not preclude the other things. It lived alongside them, alongside the weight of James in her arms, and Sarah's furious determination to stand upright, and Cole's crooked smile, and the way the kitchen smelled in the morning when he'd already been up for an hour and had coffee going before she came downstairs. Grief and love occupied the same space without canceling each other out. She hadn't known that before. She knew it now. The letter from Margaret came on a Wednesday in May. Hannah almost didn't recognize the handwriting. It was shaky, pressed harder than usual, the letters formed with the careful effort of someone whose hand wasn't entirely steady. She opened it at the kitchen table with James in her lap, eating something she couldn't identify, which was how James spent most of his time lately. The letter was short. It said, "Carl hit me." Not the first time. I didn't know what to do. Can I come? Hannah sat at the table for a long moment. She read it again. Not because she hadn't understood it the first time, but because the first time your body needs to catch up to what your mind has already taken in, and she needed a moment for her hands to stop doing what they were doing, and for her to breathe through the things she was feeling, which was several things at once. Fear for her sister, fury at Carl, and underneath that, a specific sharp guilt. The guilt of someone who has been looking at a thing for a long time without seeing it clearly. She had known Carl was a difficult man. She had known he was unkind, dismissive, the kind of man who measures everyone in the room against his own convenience. She had not let herself know the rest of it. She gave James to Cole, who was in the barn, but came immediately when she called because something in her voice told him to come immediately. She showed him the letter. He read it. His jaw went the way it went when he was containing something. "Go," he said. "I'll manage here. She might need a few days, maybe more. Hannah, go get your sister." She was on the road within the hour. She found Margaret at Dottie Phelps' house, where she'd been for 2 days. Dottie, who had the instincts of someone who has been watching a situation for a while and knew what to do when it arrived. Margaret had a bruise under her left eye that she'd done a poor job of covering, and a look about her that Hannah recognized from the inside, the specific, exhausted look of someone who has been managing something impossible for so long that the managing has become the whole of their existence, and they've forgotten what anything else felt like. They sat in Dottie's front room. Dottie made herself scarce with the practiced tact of someone who has done this before. "How long?" Hannah said. Margaret looked at her hands. "A while." Margaret. "A long while." She said it quietly. "It wasn't... I kept thinking it would get better. After the hard times passed. After money was easier. After the kids were older." She paused. "There's always a reason to wait. You should have told me. You had enough. You had your own..." "Margaret!" Hannah leaned forward. "You are my sister. There is no version of enough where you don't tell me that." Margaret looked at her. Her eyes were wet, but she was holding it together, the way she always held things together. Slightly too long, past the point where it would have been healthier to let go. "Carl's at the house," Margaret said. "He says he didn't mean it. He always says he didn't mean it." "I know. He'll say he'll change." "I know. Will you? She stopped. Started again. Hannah, do you think it's. Do you think people actually change? Actually change, not just for a while. Hannah sat with that. She didn't want to give the easy answer. Margaret deserved the honest one. I think some people do, she said. I think it's rare, and I think it takes them deciding to change, not someone else waiting for them to. And I think, she paused, I think you've been waiting for a long time, and I don't think the waiting has worked. Margaret nodded slowly, like she'd already known this, and had just needed to hear it from outside her own head. I don't have anywhere to go, she said. Her voice was small, which was not a voice Hannah associated with Margaret. We have the children, and the house is Carl's name, and I'm not like you. I don't know how to just walk out in the middle of the night and make something work. Hannah looked at her sister. This woman who had made space in her storage room, who had worried and warned and come out to the ranch twice a week and cried at the county clerk's wedding and sent the letter when she finally had no other option. You can come to us, Hannah said. You and the kids. There's room. Cole already told me to come get you. Margaret looked at her. He doesn't even know me. He knows you're mine, Hannah said. That's enough for him. She brought Margaret and the 3 children back to the ranch the next day. Cole met them in the yard and helped with the bags without a word about it, which was one of the things Hannah had come to understand was particular to him. The way he expressed welcome through action rather than speech, quietly making room in a way that didn't require acknowledgement. They put Margaret in the spare room. The children, who were 6 and 8 and 4, and initially suspicious of everything, were won over in stages, first by the barn and the horses, then by James, who was a month younger than the youngest, and engaged in the kind of parallel play that small children fall into without ceremony, and finally by Sarah, who had now figured out walking and applied it to everything and had a way of looking at new people that suggested she was deciding something important about them, and they'd better wait. Carl came the following week. He came on a Tuesday morning, and Hannah saw him coming up the road from the kitchen window for the second time in her life. And for the second time, she registered the shape of trouble before she could name it. Carl drove the wagon with the deliberate, careful pace of a man who has planned what he's going to say and is holding himself to it. Cole was in the barn. Hannah did not go to get him. She opened the door herself. Carl looked at her from the wagon. He had the expression of a man who has done something he's ashamed of and has decided that the solution is to restore the circumstances that existed before the thing he did. I've come for Margaret, he said. Margaret isn't here, Hannah said, which was technically true, in that Margaret was in the garden behind the house and not literally present in this conversation, but Hannah was willing to be technical about it. Hannah. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was trying to sound reasonable without quite feeling it. This is a family matter. Yes, she said. It is. She's my wife. She is. And my children are perfectly well, Hannah said. They've been here a week, and they're eating and sleeping, and the older one has apparently made friends with our horse, which I thought was unlikely, but here we are. Carl's jaw tightened. He climbed down from the wagon, which she hadn't invited him to do, and came toward the door with the deliberate movement of a man reasserting something. I'd like to see my wife, he said. I know you would. Hannah didn't move from the doorway. Carl, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the way it's intended, which is plainly and without any extra in it. She kept her voice even. She had spent months keeping her voice even in conversations she didn't want to have, and she was, at this point, good at it. Margaret is here because she needed somewhere safe to be. She can stay as long as she needs. What happens after that is between you and her, and it will be her decision and not yours or mine. What is ma'am? Carl stared at her. She's my... I heard you the first time. She looked at him without malice, because she was not going to have malice in this, whatever else she had. Go home, Carl. Let her have some time. If she wants to talk to you, she will. Behind her, she heard the back door, and then Cole's footsteps through the kitchen, and then he was beside her in the doorway, not saying anything, just there, with the specific quality of a man who is not threatening anything but wants to be clearly visible. Carl looked at Cole, then at Hannah, Then at the general situation that he'd arrived expecting to control and had found was not available for controlling. He stood there for a long moment. Tell her He stopped. Something moved across his face. Tell her the children's clothes are in a trunk in the bedroom. She'll want to know where they are. He paused. The winter ones, too. It was not an apology. It was not anything close to sufficient, but it was something from Carl. Some piece of practical consideration, some acknowledgement of what she might need. And Hannah, who had been prepared to feel nothing for Carl except whatever was between anger and contempt, felt something more complicated than that, which annoyed her, and was also, she thought, honest. I'll tell her, she said. He climbed back into the wagon and drove back down the road without looking at them again. Cole stood beside her watching the wagon go. That went better than I thought. Don't give him too much credit for it, Hannah said. I'm not. I just thought he'd be louder. Margaret, when Hannah found her in the garden and told her, stood very still for a moment. Then she said, The winter coats are in the trunk too. He forgot to mention the coats. He probably didn't want to give you too much at once. Margaret looked at the garden, at the early lettuces that had come up in the last 2 weeks, because Hannah had planted them in the row along the south wall where the sun was warmest. I don't know what I'm going to do, Margaret said. Not long term. I don't know. You don't have to know yet. That's not... Hannah, I have 3 children and no income and no... Margaret, Hannah stopped her. You are in a house with a barn and a garden and enough room. You have time to figure out the rest of it. That's not nothing. That's the whole difference. Margaret looked at her. How do you do that? Do what? Sound like you mean it even when everything is still a mess. Hannah thought about that. Practice, she said. Mostly just practice. Summer settled over the Barrett Ranch. The garden came up, Hannah's lettuces and beans, and the tomatoes Cole built the stakes for without being asked, coming home one evening with wood he'd cut at the mill and spending the evening in the side yard while Hannah watched from the window and Sarah supervised from her hip. Margaret found work in town 3 days a week at the dry goods counter, where Mabel Finch had started being civil to her in the careful way that people are civil when they've decided to revise an opinion but aren't ready to advertise it. The children grew. Sarah and James grew faster, as if trying to make up for the slow and difficult beginning. In July, Hannah knew she was pregnant before she told anyone, in the way that women who have been pregnant before know their bodies with a specific alertness. She told Cole on a Thursday evening when the twins were in bed and the house was quiet and the summer light was going long and amber through the west window. He went still in the way he went still when something was too large for an immediate response. When? He said. February, I think. Late February. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched his face do several things. Not all of them entirely comfortable, because they were not people who pretended that complicated was simple. And a third baby with 2 13-month-olds and a ranch and a sister's family already in the house was genuinely complicated. Then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, carefully. The way you hold something you're aware is precious and also real. Okay, he said into her hair. It's a lot, she said. It's a lot, he agreed. They stood there for a minute in the amber light. We'll need to expand the room off the kitchen, he said. Before winter, I can start in August. That's the practical thing to say right now. Would you prefer I say something else? No, she admitted. That's exactly right. He laughed quietly, the way Cole laughed. Rare enough that she still noticed every time, still felt the specific warmth of it. She had told him to say things plainly, in the beginning. He'd been doing it ever since, and she'd been doing it back, and it had not made everything smooth. They'd had arguments that were direct and uncomfortable and required sitting with the discomfort until something resolved, and they'd had nights where the exhaustion made everything harder, and mornings where everything was better, and the particular ongoing arithmetic of 2 people building something real together. It was not the story she'd expected, but she had stopped expecting a story. Margaret stayed through the summer and into the fall, working her 3 days a week and saving what she earned and writing letters to Carl that she didn't always show Hannah and that Carl sometimes wrote back to. It was slow and uncertain, and nobody was pretending it was simple. At the end of September, Margaret told Hannah she was thinking of going back. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the twins asleep and the house quiet. He wrote that he's been talking to the minister in Delridge, Margaret said. He said he's been talking to someone about the things he does, the way he is. That could be true, Hannah said. I know. It could also be something he's saying. I know that too. Hannah looked at her sister. What does your gut tell you? Margaret was quiet for a long time. That it's different this time, but I've thought that before. Then don't go back all the way, Hannah said. Go slow. See him with the children, see how that is. Give it time before you move back in. Make him earn it back. He won't like that. No, Hannah agreed. If he's changed, he'll do it anyway. If he hasn't changed, you'll know faster. Margaret sat with that. That's harder than just going or just not going. Yes, Hannah said, but the hard middle road is the one that's actually honest. Margaret went back to Callow Creek in October, moving back into her own house gradually, cautiously, the way you test ice you're not sure about. Carl did not like the slow terms. He honored them anyway. Hannah kept watching and kept Margaret close enough to come quickly if that changed, and tried to understand that she could not save her sister from the choices her sister had to make. That understanding that you cannot hold a person safe from their own life, that the most you can do is be there, was one of the things Hannah had learned the hard way and was still learning. You could be the house someone came to in the dark. You could not choose for them whether to come. The baby was born in February, on a night that was cold and clear, a year to the month from when Hannah and Cole had stood in the county clerk's office with a secretary and a basket and made something official that had already been real for a long time. They named her Clara. She was born loud, which the doctor said was a very good sign, and she stayed loud, which anyone who spent 5 minutes with her understood was simply the truth of her character. She had Hannah's coloring and Cole's directness, and from the first week she had a way of fixing people with her gaze that suggested she was evaluating whether they were worth her time and had not yet made a final decision. Sarah, 13 months old, accepted Clara with the imperial generosity of someone acknowledging a smaller nation. James sat beside the cradle for a long time the first morning, looking at Clara with the focused intensity he brought to new phenomena, and then turned to Hannah and delivered a serious monologue that had the structure of an important statement and patted her hand when he was done. And that was his position made clear. Cole held Clara for a long time the first night, sitting in the chair by the fire while Hannah slept, and Hannah woke once and saw him there, and did not say anything, because some things are private even between people who have chosen plainness. She had survived Thomas and Lily and the storage room, and 2 miles of dark road, and Francis Aldrich, and James Prentice, and Eleanor Grantham's careful honesty, and Carl, and her own fear, which had been the hardest of all of them. She was not a woman who had been rescued. That was the thing she understood now, the thing she wanted most to be true about how this story was told, if anyone ever told it. A man had not come along and fixed what was broken. She had been the one to walk through the dark. She had been the one to knock on the door. She had been the one to stay when staying was hard and leave when leaving was necessary and come back when it was right and make those calls herself, with the information she had at the time. Cole was not her rescue. He was her choice. And there was a very large difference between those two things. The town of Callow Creek adjusted, the way towns do. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but gradually through the slow accumulation of ordinary contact. People who had once crossed the street began to nod. The woman from the laundry, whose brief nod on the church steps had been one of the first, became over time something close to a friendly acquaintance. Francis Aldrich remained cautious, and Hannah did not expect more than that, and they got on after a fashion. Dottie Phelps was simply Dottie Phelps, warm, interested, slightly indiscriminate in what she relayed to whom, and had never really been the problem. There were people who never came around. Hannah was honest enough to expect that and to find she could live with it. She was not trying to win the town. She was trying to live in it. Spring came again. The apple tree bloomed for the first time since Hannah had arrived. White flowers, small and crowded, covering the bare gray branches with something that looked excessive and improbable after the long winter. Hannah stood in the side yard looking at it for a long time with Clara on her hip and James running in circles around her legs for reasons he didn't explain. Cole came and stood beside her. "Sarah planted that tree," he said. "I know. First year we were here. She picked the variety herself from the catalog. Said the ones with the white flowers made better pies than the ones with the pink." He looked at it. She was right, as it turned out. Most things she picked seemed to have worked out, Hannah said. He looked at her. The particular look of a man who has learned not to sidestep things that matter. Yes, he said. They stood there, the two of them and Clara and James, in the side yard of a ranch that had been failing in February of the previous year and was not failing now. The apple tree bloomed in the indifferent, extravagant way that trees bloom when the conditions are finally right, without any awareness of how long the winter was or how unlikely the spring seemed. Hannah looked at the tree and thought about Lily, and thought about the dark road, and thought about the chair by the fire in a stranger's house, and a boy who was smaller than 2 fists and needed something she had left to give. She had not planned any of this. She had not been building toward it. She had been surviving, day by day, decision by decision, and the decisions had accumulated into something she could not have imagined from inside any single one of them. That was the thing, she thought. That was the thing no one tells you, or maybe they tell you and you can't hear it until you've lived enough to understand it. The future does not arrive whole. It comes in pieces, ordinary pieces, most of them difficult, and you put them down one at a time without being able to see the shape they're making. And one day you look up and the shape is there. Clara made a sound against her shoulder. James ran past, still in his circles, for reasons known only to James. Inside, she could hear Sarah saying something authoritative to the cat. The apple tree bloomed. Hannah Barrett. She had taken the name without ceremony, without announcement, because it was simply accurate now, stood in the April morning with her family around her and her hands full, and her history behind her and every reason she'd needed to keep going right here in the yard. She had walked 3 miles in the dark with nothing left but the one thing she still had. It had been enough. It had been, as it turned out, exactly enough.